let me introduce our honored guest for today. So Mr. Chen Wu from Economist Group, Chief Editor for Economist Global Business Review. And Ms. Zhang, not sitting here, maybe out of the room, Senior Marketing Manager of Economist Global Business Review. And also Mr. Niejing from Shanghai Municipal Human Resources and Social Security Bureau, Head of Startup Empowerment, and also a beloved Professor, Mr. Shameen, Prashantham. Happy to see all of the guests, and let me introduce you what will be the topics. Just a quick view on that. So we'll have 3 sessions. The first session will be a 30 minutes dialogue on corporate startup partnering between Professor Shameen and Mr. Wu. And the second part, session 2, will be 30 minutes panel discussion on empowerment. How do you get empowerment from entrepreneurial ecosystem? It will be a panel. I will present a panel and invite all the guests to the stage. And the third part, I will show you after the classroom session to eLab, and we prepare some drinks there. So without further ado, let me invite Shameen and Mr. Wu on the stage.
Really great to be back at CEIBS campus. I recall the last time I visited was 3.5 years ago when I was at another panel when I think the campus was open without any restrictions, right? So important, that's the key thing, without any restrictions. We would hope in the next 3 to 6 months we can get everything back to normal. I think the reason I'm here is because Professor, Prashantham?
Yeah, but this probably Shameen.
Yeah, Shameen. Professor Shameen had a new book, Gorillas Can Dance, right? So I think everyone knows the metaphor, David and gorilla, right? So we think the startups and the big guys, the giants, are not compatible with each other. We think the startups are trying their best to try to overthrow the rule of the giants, but at the same time, the Economist had a term saying that many of these giants have set up their kill zones. So there are 3 options when they see a promising startup. You buy them, you copy them, you kill them, right? So, but I think Professor Shameen, in his book, provided a different perspective. So I think that's very interesting. So how do gorillas work with David? And how do they come up with a very collaborative relationship? I think that's the theme of the book. Maybe Professor Shameen, just a brief introduction of the book, and then we can get into the nitty-gritty.
Okay, so thank you very much for the question and the introduction, and just for the benefit of the audience. Now, this poor audience has met me a few times already. They're all, the vast majority of them are brand new students, but they've had to suffer seeing me a fair bit because first last week, I think they saw me mainly as an MBA program director, and then this week, they see me in the classroom as a professor. I'm teaching one of the early courses that they have. Actually, this conversation is more to do with me just being an academic, and, you know, as professors, we try to develop some distinctive body of knowledge. And for many years, I've been studying how big companies and startups work together. And I think the way you put it is very interesting in that very often when big companies and startups get together or confront each other, there's tendency to view this as somewhat conflictual. But what I found was that there's also scope for collaboration. And basically, what the book is trying to do is to, based on about 1.5 decades of research, different parts of the world, distill some lessons in terms of how these big companies and small companies can work together. But of course, when you write a piece or a book, you need to pick an audience. And this is actually written for the big companies. But I must say that early on in my research, I actually was writing it for the startups. So I graduated with my PhD in 2005 And what happens if you decide to become an academic is even after you finish your PhD, you have to keep doing research and keep publishing. It's the part of the professor's life you don't see, which is different from this classroom part. And I got interested in how I began to observe in Scotland how big companies and startups were partnering together. And I asked a very senior, very eminent professor at a conference, do you think it makes sense to study this phenomenon? So this is back in 2006. And he said, I don't think these small companies have a choice. They need to learn to dance with the big gorilla. So my first article was actually dancing with gorillas from the point of view of the startup. But over many years, I noticed that even these big companies were trying to engage with the startups, and so hence gorillas can dance.
Yeah, so I think there are quite a few interesting perspectives that we can ask. So the first one would be, how would a successful giant who's willing and capable of dancing with Davids, what kind of mindset they need to change? What kind of mindset they need to adopt? Because we know giant companies are bureaucracies by nature, right? And of course, they are big at scaling things, but gradually they kind of lose touch of how do they start innovation. So the first thing comes to mind when you talk about the relationship is that they may want to work with Davids, partnering with them so that they can seek more innovation, or at least a kind of an innovative drive. But they need to unlearn the way they manage a bureaucracy and adopt something new to make it work. What kind of changes you have observed that's critical for this kind of relationship to work?
That's a fantastic question. So when I wrote my first article called Dancing with Gorillas, actually the examples in that book, in that article, were very hard to find, and it was more like happy accidents. Either some maverick manager in a big company was, interested to talk to startups, and it was very unusual in the company, or there was a startup entrepreneur who was unusually gutsy and would, try to make it happen, and it was very ad hoc. What changed over time, I think, are three things in terms of mindset, since you used that word. I think one is that the big companies began to realize that there was the need for them to have an entrepreneurial mindset. And I think digitalization was a big driver for this.
In terms of enable them to talk to more people, or
realizing that they would be toast a few years down the road if they didn't change.
So the kind of urgency.
Exactly. Because even back in 2008, when my article came out, Dancing with Gorillas, there was one industry that by then had actually become fairly mature in talking to startups, which was the pharma industry. They had figured out that if they worked with biotech startups, it could accelerate their process of new product development. I was talking mainly, and I've done a lot of work with software startups, talking to big companies, and my initial work, a lot of it was with Microsoft, IBM, SAP, these kinds of companies. And this is where initially it was very ad hoc, and then it started getting more systematic. These companies themselves were beginning to realize that they would get disrupted. So the potential for open software movement, for example, was getting Microsoft nervous, and eventually as they were getting into cloud. But one industry where people could not understand what I was talking about in 2008 was the automotive industry. For them, working with another company meant you control them. They only knew vertical. They had no clue about horizontal. Fast forward a few years, they were dealing with connectivity, electrification, autonomous, and so a lot of this driven by digital. And that's what I mean. That was, I think, a big spur towards humility.
Or the kind of rapid changes
exactly.
in digitalization.
Exactly. So you realize staying the same isn't an option. And so and hence you need to be entrepreneurial, but the other mindset that then started creeping in was this collaborative mindset. it's not just about buying them, killing them, that kind of thing. There's also seeking win-win outcomes. And then the third, I think, is also a global mindset. And so it became, especially for the large multinationals, it became apparent that there's amazing talent to be tapped into. And especially pre-COVID, I think many of these companies were trying to get the best out of various startup ecosystems.
That's actually the fourth one when the Economist covered it, is that you try to buy a company to actually get the talents.
Exactly, yes.
So you highlight a few things. I think, biotech and pharmaceutical companies are a good example, because I think we have a very interesting and vibrant startup scene, and then we have mature pharmaceutical companies who are very good at testing, getting the new drug, going through the regulatory hurdles, and then get them distributed to hospitals and everything. So it seems as if it's a good match, right? You want smaller companies focusing on developing new drugs, and you want mature companies as a launching pad for developing a business case, a business model. And then, of course, in the last 10 years, we also witnessed an interesting case. That's Facebook bought the Instagram, right? In a way, if you read all these colorful accounts, it's kind of interesting, because Instagram was only a year and a half old, was 10 employees, but Facebook give the two co-founders a kind of a offer that no one, I think, in the room can resist. If you say $1 billion for a company with only 10 employees, you probably would get. And then in retrospect, the co-founders would say what gets them excited is not only Facebook's $1 billion offer, but also Facebook says, we can help you launch your products and services. We can help you grow much faster. You don't have to deal with finance, legal, and all the other things. Just get focused on product and services. In the first 5 years, I think the magic works. So it's also an unprecedented case where the co-founders stay on for almost 6 years. But in year 6, when Zuckerberg wanted to have one bigger Facebook, everything changed. So I want to use this two examples, but I think there are many examples in your book. So there are many different ways of having this collaboration work, but there's always a power dynamic. What kind of power dynamic do you think are healthy, and what are kind of traps you want to avoid?
Yeah, that's a very, very reasonable question. So I think one of the reasons why that phrase "dancing with gorillas" resonated with a lot of people is that there's a hint of danger. When you dance with the gorilla, you can get trampled as well. So it's not as if it's totally risk-free. And one of the big challenges is the big power differential. So therein lies actually one of the great challenges, because you have big differences between these companies that results in complementarity. That's the whole rationale, basically, behind these kinds of partnering. But then you also, by the same token, have these big differences, including that of power. And just to sort of take one step back, one of the classic ways of looking at what organizations do, a famous professor at Stanford who died a couple of years ago in his 90s, James March, had said many years ago, basically companies do two things: exploitation and exploration. Yeah. So they exploit the capabilities that they have, and they explore or build new capabilities. So in the early stage, a company is exploring new capabilities, developing its competencies, and then when it becomes good at what it's doing and is able to make money, then the tendency is to keep doing more of the same, right? But then that's great up to a point. Then you also need to have the exploration. That's the basic challenge that many companies have, dealing with the two. And all things being equal, companies tend to gravitate towards exploitation, focusing on the short-term gain, and even to some extent, if you have quarterly earnings reports, then they're going to look better if you keep focusing on the exploitation. So then the exploration tends to get sacrificed. And I think with the pharma biotech, for example, pharma companies could continue to exploit their scale, their marketing muscle, and then the startup is able to explore the new drugs. In fact, some of the success stories around COVID for the vaccination is exactly that, right? The so-called Pfizer vaccine was actually developed by a small biotech company in Germany. So that's the broad logic, and I think, therefore, the crux of the takeaway is that some companies have recognized that they need to manage the partnership carefully. So just because there is an obvious complementarity, meaning that on paper it looks like a great idea, doesn't mean that it's easy to pull off the collaboration. And so this sort of collaboration is effortful rather than effortless. The very things that make it attractive to work together also makes it difficult. And in fact, when I mentioned this to someone, he said, "Oh, that reminds me of marriage."
That's literally what I'm going to say. Yeah. But you also mentioned, I think, something crucial. So for big corporations to have a long-term vision, then they would have a balanced view on exploitation and exploration. But of course, I think tragically in the most recent years, we've seen many big companies at the mercy of Wall Street, or we have very good finance managers running the show. And then, of course, if you take Boeing as an example, not a good example, you would argue that the kind of engineering capabilities and mindset are being overshadowed by finance managers who actually wanted to just squeeze more profit rather than have a long-term vision about things. So in your book, do you think that that's also an important element, that you are not simply just being a good finance manager may not have the kind of vision? You need to have a kind of more diverse team.
Exactly. Absolutely. So, if you come back to those mindsets that we were talking about, right? An entrepreneurial mindset, collaborative mindset, global mindset, we can think of this as something that organizations have, but we can also think of it as what individuals within organizations have. And the people that I have studied, and in the book, I mention many companies, but I also mention the names of many individual managers. Because in the end, it really comes down to what people do. And there are many instances where actually the initial impetus came up in a very bottom-up, informal way where people who weren't told to do this, but they were essentially being intrapreneurs, not finance managers, who were observing this opportunity. So for example, Bayer, since we mentioned pharmaceutical companies, Bayer, everybody I think knows, big German company that makes aspirin. It's about as old traditional fuddy-duddy as you can think about, right? There was this Cuban-born scientist based in Berlin, Jesus Del Valle, who basically 10 years ago got the feeling that pharma companies need to start taking digital seriously. So they already were working with biotech startups, but it would also be important to work with digital health startups. So nobody gave him a brief, nobody gave him a budget or anything. He just took a little bit of money, a small pot of money from whatever he was doing, and said, let's give grants to a few students who can come up with apps. And he came up with a very imaginative title, Grants for Apps, and abbreviated it to G4A. And then, so a lot of clever students came and started doing these apps. Then the next year he thought, why does it have to be students? Can't it be startups? But he already had something to show, right? So a bunch of students had done some apps, and people in Bayer were thinking, oh yeah, we need to be thinking about digital health. So the next year, he got a little bit of support, a little bit of money, and he got 5 startups to work together to come into the Bayer office in Berlin, and they had a 100-day accelerator. And okay, then at the end of those 100 days, the most important outcome for him was, because they had brought them into their own building, a very boring gray building in Berlin, if you've seen the Bayer office, these guys were rubbing shoulders with the scientists, with the informatics guys. A lot of it was happening informally, and those guys were also seeing what these startups were capable of. The next year, they went one step further, and they said, oh, we can actually do it in Berlin, but open it up to startups from anywhere in the world. So there was one Korean startup, and so on. And then, from 2016 onwards, different countries started doing their version of it, including here in Shanghai, which is how I came to know about it. And in China, they made it an 88-day program rather than a 100-day program. But you see, I think it all goes back to one guy, Jesus, who I think was entrepreneurial, collaborative, and global in mindset. Didn't think about whose permission I need to get, what some financial manager will think, etc., etc. Just got started. And to his good fortune, from a very early stage, maybe the way he started was also brilliant, right? It was a very low-cost, but somewhat high-impact way to start. Give a little bit of money to some students to create apps. You have something to show for it. And then it went up from there.
So planting the seed, having a can-do attitude, and also try to build the credibility, right? So that's important if you want to start kind of or spread the entrepreneur spirit within a bureaucracy. But I think, I want to flip, turn the table and share. You think you started with the startup mindset, but I think for startups nowadays, literally they have 2 or 3 options, right? They can either take money from VCs and private equities, and of course, it's not only the money, but also the kind of network, the kind of support, the kind of the ecosystem that they can plug into. They can go to a corporate ecosystem where the corporates definitely have their more specific needs, but the corporate may have more in-depth knowledge about a certain industry where the startups could play a complementary role. What's the major difference between these 2 choices? Yeah. Someone taking money from the VCs and try to grow, relying on not a very structured network. Whereas I would argue that in the corporate thing, it's a bit more structured, and then the objectives, the corporates would be, I would argue that they would have more in-depth communication about the objectives that the corporates would see from the startups, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair description of the 2 things. The only thing I would say is that they're not mutually exclusive. Okay. So in fact, most of the startups that have done very well with these corporate partnerships are also VC invested. In fact, over time, what has happened is a nice symbiosis between all of these actors, whereby many of the big companies who accept startup participants into their accelerator program or whatever, typically have some VC funding. And in fact, the people in the big companies who run these startup programs build networks with VCs and actively seek recommendations from them. Now, interestingly, about 10 years ago, when these Western companies started realizing, oh, China is now getting these great startups, India now has these great startups, and they're coming to emerging markets, they were then dealing with somewhat less mature ecosystems than, say, Silicon Valley. Okay. And there were VCs, but the VCs were also relatively nascent. So I noticed something interesting. In Silicon Valley, the corporates were looking at who the VCs were investing in, and then, narrowing down their search to those. In China and India, the VCs were looking to see, which corporates are, which are the startups getting into the corporates. But I think basically you're quite right. I think they are 2 very different kinds of networks. I think with the VCs, it's basically a return on investment. And so What they bring to the party is the VC mindset of maybe some sort of discipline, making sure that in the end you hit some milestones. I think with the corporates, it's very much more of a strategic, let's say, synergy that they're looking for. And so I think the savvy startups are able to leverage the two. And you know, there are some companies that also do a lot of corporate venture capital. In fact, in the first batch of the startups that worked with Bayer in China back in 2016, there was one entrepreneur who had developed a very thin digital thermometer that was targeted at babies. So, you know, it could be affixed to their forehead, and it was so thin they wouldn't even feel it. And then when they are sleeping, their temperature is monitored. And if the temperature goes up, then, you know, the parent's mobile phone would set off an alarm. In the course of being in the Bayer program in Shanghai, they got to know another German company that was sort of in the Bayer ecosystem, who were also very interested in this digital thermometer. And then that company ended up becoming a corporate investor in this startup.
And then what would be the kind of end game, a happy ending for this kind of marriage?
That is the great, the great imponderable. And so many possibilities.
Do you think the corporate collaborator or corporate initiators would want to make things very specific, saying that, you know, I want to invest you, and if you grow to a certain stage, I have the intention of acquiring you? Would that be a good start point, or you don't want to provide too much of a constraint? Yeah. You want the company you invest just to grow rather than having a specific target in mind?
Yeah, very, very good question. I think I've seen two very different approaches. One is that, you know, the big company thinks of these younger startups, relatively early stage startups, as potential partners without putting in any investment. And so you have this big pipeline coming through, and then you can say, okay, then a subset of them that are showing a lot of promise, as they mature, we can put in some investment, and then over time, another small subset of that maybe we can acquire. So that's one way of thinking about it. But in reality, what I've found is it's much more messy. So, for example, there was one company that was starting a startup partnering program in one of the Asian markets, and they called their corporate venture capital arm, which was very well known in the industry, and said, you know, do you want to come and keep an eye on these startups? And those guys said, frankly, just forget about it. You do your thing. The ones that are really successful, eventually they will come on our radar. And then the M&A team. So I think there's two ways to look at it. I think one, in theory, there can be a nice pipeline of the early stage startups, the later stage ones that get, you know, like a 10% investment, and then a subset of them that get acquired. In reality, I think many of these companies do things in parallel. I think maybe something in between is useful. You know, I think these various entities in the big company should be talking to each other, but not approach this in such a rigid way, because the fact of the matter is, from the startup's point of view too, many of them want to have options as well, you know, because going back to the power dynamics, one of the things that they want to avoid in many cases is they don't want to get pinned down to a company.
Or you don't want to get locked in, right?
Locked in, that's the exact, yeah.
Final question, I think we are running out of time. And what do you think many of these Chinese giants could learn from the lessons in your book?
So, I think, first of all, you know, the internet giants in China have really been very active in the startup ecosystem. So I remember seeing a report on corporate venture capital, which showed that in Silicon Valley, it accounted for about 5% of the total risk capital that was available. But in China, it was accounting for 40%. However, 90% of that 40% was accounted for by BAT. So I think what's happened in China, it's sort of twofold. I think one, you had this situation where these internet giants became very powerful, and then startups felt they had to ally with one or another.
And they have to side with one.
Right, which reminds me of the Cold War. And there was a time when we had forgotten about the Cold War. Sadly, we talk about it again. But it was like you would see a conflict between Iran and Iraq, and actually, the Soviets were supporting one and the US was supporting one, right? And
proxy wars.
Proxy wars. 5 years ago, there was Mobike and Orfo, and one was backed by Ali, one was backed by Tencent, right? That sort of thing. And I think there is room for this sort of additional, more collaborative,
or more open competition.
Slightly more open. But I do think actually that the Western companies also can have valuable lessons to learn from BAT, because what they were forced to do, I think in some ways, was to think of ways to add value, and there was a certain level of, in a sense, deeper commitment. So I think there's mutual learning from both sides. Thank you very much.
So next session, Professor and Ms. Wu, they have mentioned a lot about corporate startup partnering. And for you, a lot of you, I believe you will go to enterprises and doing innovative jobs. But still, many of you may one day, or you are already doing startups, and you are wondering, what can we get from the entrepreneurial ecosystem? So for the next session, it will be a panel discussion. Let me invite Mr. Liu and also your classmates Jenny on the stage, and we will talk about how do you benefit from the entrepreneurial ecosystem to your own work or startups. So the reason we set up this panel discussion is because we are from same perspective on helping or supporting our students in entrepreneurship. But also we are from different perspectives. Mr. Wu is more from observer or media perspective, and Professor mostly from academia point of view. And Mr. Liu is from the government. I still remember one time a very senior entrepreneur told me one sentence I still remember. I think it's very, very insightful. He told me that when you are doing startup, your point of view should be from moon to earth, and from earth to different nations. And from different nations, you look at different industries. And from that, you look at entrepreneurs and startups. We don't have to agree totally, but that also speaks a very important part, which is our public service in empowering entrepreneurships and innovation. So I will firstly ask Mr. Liu from Shanghai HR and Social Security Bureau. They have several aims in the whole system. And Mr. Liu is in charge of entrepreneurship empowerment. And a lot of people, especially, our students, when you're doing early startups, you ask me, what can we get from the whole ecosystem? So I will let Mr. Liu introduce from this public service point of view.
Dear faculty and students, actually I have made my presence first time in CEIBS 5 years ago, and had a very heated discussion with alumni from CEIBS at that time. Why I am a director from the Shanghai Human Resources and Social Security, I'm providing entrepreneurship empowerment. So what is that supposed to be? Actually, the entrepreneurial empowerment was also proposed by the Economic Bureau as well as for the Tech Bureau. But actually, the first department who has proposed this kind of concept is Human Resources Department. In 2007, we have this employment promotion law, which has been legalized officially. And in 2008, we have the document. And we know that this kind of mass entrepreneurship and innovation wave started from 2015. And what happened 1 year before? That our Premier Li Keqiang has proposed the mass entrepreneurship and innovation in the Davos summit of summer. So that has started and kicked off the entrepreneurship innovation in China. Actually, mass entrepreneurship and innovation is a topic heatedly discussed not only by Shanghainese, but also Chinese, and also we are serving our clients from all over the world. But starting an enterprises is never a job easy. We need support and services. We know that in Shanghai, we have micro businesses, we have small businesses, we have medium businesses, and we have large businesses. And the government way of distribution labor is very, very clear. For example, at the bottom, we have laborers, workers, and students in a very early way. And this is the business of the Human Resources Department and Education Department. Actually, they are supporting these college graduates very much. For example, giving them subsidies, credits, loans, and sometimes give them free of charge services. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the Tech Bureau. The Technology Bureau is supporting the small businesses and the medium-sized businesses in a very strong way. And also, we provide this kind of main support in order to spur up their innovation spirit. And thirdly, I would like to talk about the Economic and Information Community, which is a supporting organization as well. And now I'm going to mention the industries. For example, some science and technology and culture sector. For instance, the Culture and Tourism Bureau and also the Publicity Department is going to support some cultural creation functions, and this is their businesses. And also for the Fiscal Bureau, in China, we have just seen that the Fiscal Bureau has issued a fund of 10 billion RMB to serve as the guarantee fund for SMEs. So as a startup enterprise, you can apply for the fund to as small as 100,000 RMB to as large as 20 million RMB if you are capable of doing that. So when we are talking about entrepreneurship and innovation, one word we cannot ignore that is attracting businesses, which is at the bottom of this logic. Maybe some of you have heard the Professor Giles from Economist, and he has a book, The Secrets to China's Economy. He said the economy, the business attraction, and which is below the county level, they are the bottom line. They are the mainstream of China's economy. And also, we know that nowadays China's economy is very sluggish, and the downturn pressure on economy is gaining momentum. So governments, in order for them to survive, they have to collaborate. For example, the Fiscal and Taxation Department, they would like to gain their taxes and also refund part of the taxes, but these are very, very stable. Okay, just now is a brief discussion about the system of China's entrepreneurship and innovation. I'm starting from the small and micro businesses to medium and large businesses. And also, we have different ways for supporting these types of businesses. And ever since 2015, the atmosphere for attracting businesses and starting up enterprises has been gaining momentum in China.
Let me move on to the second question. So everybody sitting here, I mean, we all have international exposure, or you might do something in big corporation or your own business regarding the global business. So I would like to ask all the panelists to share from your perspective and the cases you have seen about successful stories of entrepreneurs playing their startup playing in more global sort of ecosystem. I will start from Mr. Wu. Thank you.
I think the company come to my mind is Chen, right? So the company that being started by an entrepreneur in Niejing and moved to Hangzhou. But was a specific target of developing countries as well as developed countries. So more people in the United States have bought things on Shein than, no, I don't think anyone in China has done any deal with Shein, because Shein doesn't provide any services. So that's an interesting case study. A, leveraging on the supply chain, value chain proposition in China, because China is the largest manufacturer of clothing. B, leveraging on the digital transformation, as Professor Shen has just highlighted. Without digital connections, it's very, very hard for a Chinese company to sell into huge markets in the States and other places. And the third thing, of course, is the most interesting and still developing, leveraging on the KOLs and KOCs, the kind of influencer economy. Again, very new, but trendy. So that's also highlight I would say either the benefit or the power of social media.
So incidentally, I joined the school in 2015, okay, July 2015. So it was very much a few months after Premier Li Keqiang had said mass innovation, mass entrepreneurship. So it was a very interesting time to come to Shanghai. One of the things that the government was doing to support this kind of entrepreneurship was to leverage the multinational companies, which I think is one of Shanghai's major assets and sets it apart from other countries, other cities, other ecosystems in Shanghai. And in that process of being in Shanghai, some of the examples that I've seen, which I think are particularly, I mean, it would be very hard to see them in other parts of China. One example is actually another alumnus called Matthew Xie, but his name is spelled in the Hong Kong way, TSE. He was from maybe 1 or 2 years after you, 1 year after you. And both Daniel's startup and Matthew's startup were actually supported by eLab in a way. And what he has done, he has this startup called Winco Solar, which leverages China's abilities in this space, but taps a very different market, which is Africa. So a little bit of a contrasting story to Shein, right, which goes from China into advanced markets. I mean, it's taken the US by storm. This is going in a different direction and adding a lot of value in the West Africa market. He is French speaking, he's a French national, so his natural instinct was to go towards Côte d'Ivoire and other Niger and other French-speaking countries, but he's also expanding into Nigeria and Ghana. And we have a campus in Ghana, and he's very well known over there. For me, people like Daniel and Matthew, I think, are very good examples. They reflect these mindsets, entrepreneurial, collaborative, global. But I think also being based in Shanghai is a big part of it. Because the other thing I want to also mention is what I have observed in China is that it's not just the various ecosystem companies that are entrepreneurial, it is government officials who are also entrepreneurial. And by leveraging sort of some of the policy measures, the policy priorities and directions, actually there's more possibilities. And some of these things, I think, even like solar, was very much policy-driven, policy-encouraged in China, and partly explains why that expertise was available in China, which now Matthew is leveraging in the African market.
So next will be Mr. Liu. Mr. Liu has seen most of Shanghai's entrepreneurs in the past years, and please share with us some of the noticeable entrepreneurs or startups focusing not only on China's market. Thank you.
This question might be a little bit difficult for me because I'm only focusing on domestic enterprises and startups who are having a very good development in domestic China. Actually, in recent years, there are a large number of Chinese enterprises who are speeding up their speed to go overseas. And this trend is mostly evident in the gaming industry. I don't know whether you have heard a company named Footprint or Footmark. This is a company specialized in doing software at a big screen, and the users are such large in number that the servers actually collapsed due to the large volume. Actually, other CTOs from other departments who are sharing the same offices run to help them to repair the server. That's why this example is also what I previously want to illustrate, because it can show us why we government officials want to spur up the development of incubators, because they can give us ample room for fight together and win success together. So the success story of Footprint has made itself very successfully being bought by another company, and currently it has been doing another businesses. So in the interest of time, I can only share with you one story. That is Fandom reading club story. So this is a very typical case because the founder of Fandom Reading Club was situated in Beijing, and another founder named Mr. Guo. And actually, they started their innovation very first in the 200 in Shanghai. That is a practice demonstration center in Shanghai, and we give them 6 months free of rent to help them. And then they have find office spaces in the industry park of Shanghai Engineering and Technology University. So, and also we give them support, which is especially called the Unicom Fund. We can see that these enterprises are struggling very much in the beginning years. And also we give them a lot of support, for example, free of rent, some financial support, and we encourage them to take up into competitions, national competitions to win prizes, and we give a lot of government endorsement to them. And finally, they choose to situate their enterprises in Shanghai Changling district. And also, we give them a lot of the training certificates for encourage them to go through competitions, which has greatly burdened their business scope. And also, currently, they are starting a project called Starfish. That is to find partners and students who are willing to collaborate with them in different cities and universities. So we can see this is how we cultivate them. We provide human resources endorsement, incubation endorsement, investment, and also government endorsement. We help them to reduce cost, help them to expand market, and give them enough financial and legislative support. We know in China, if you want to do training, this is not something very easy. You have to get a certificate first. So Fandom made its success very good due to our support. And we all know that the vision and mission of Fandom Reading Club is that we let 0.3 billion people have access to quality reading materials. That is their mission. And Fandom is not alone. This case can be seen in many of the daily living services in Shanghai. For example, we have Tuhu, we have Ele.me, we have Dazhong. This kind of consumerism enterprises are very successful in Shanghai due to Shanghai has this kind of ecosystem to support them. And this is rarely seen in some other places. You can never find that in some other places. And even in some countries in Europe, even though we are a city, they are countries. So in Shanghai, we have the unique users resources. We build a value chain, and our proficiency has made this internet serving companies very successful in Shanghai.
Thanks, Mr. Liu. And following the answer of Mr. Liu, I think it's a very good representative of my last question. I'll ask this to our professor and Mr. Wu. As you are studying in CEIBS right now, and you're probably going to this entrepreneurial ecosystem. So you will wonder what kind of support we can give to you from our own perspective. So Mr. Liu has introduced more or less with the Fandom's example. So next, I would like to move to Professor. Can you please introduce what support we can give from your perspective, and if you have successful cases like what you mentioned, Matthew, and actually Matthew is spreading the words to our students. I mean, you asked me about Matthew and so on. So could you share based on that? Thank you.
So basically, I think when I think of entrepreneurial ecosystems, I think of it primarily as a network. And I think basically then what effort one needs to put into this is about leveraging networks. And I think what support one can look for should be to help to leverage the networks. I mean, so if you were to think of it in these terms, it seems to me that the Shanghai entrepreneurial ecosystem and the CEIBS alumni ecosystem have a lot of points of intersection. But in reality, finding them and tapping into them is also not so straightforward. So I think two things are needed. One is from the point of view of the person who wants to try to tap into it, being proactive. But I think from the point of view of the school and what support I think eLab is particularly well placed to do is to also help to navigate this. The fact that Daniel has organized this event with different stakeholders, right? People from the media who are very interested to engage with us because this is a very international kind of organization, people from government in Shanghai with an interest, and also, you know, myself as faculty, I think continue to offer these opportunities where these different stakeholders come together. I think that is something that we are in a position to do and which we do through eLab, we do through other events as well. Year before last, the person who was heading up the finance club, Woody, he did, I thought, an amazing job in setting up a finance forum for which he worked in collaboration with the MBA Alumni Association. And he got a lot of guest speakers from there, and he was able to do something. One of the key topics in this forum was about impact investing. And again, I think what becomes important in China, as you know very well, is to align what you're doing with policy priorities. One of the big priorities right now is anything to do with green. And that reminds me actually of an alum that I recently met, Daniel also knows. He studied back in 2012, before I joined. But accidentally it came to my notice that a decade ago, he and two of his classmates, just totally out of their own initiative, created a green campus project. Okay? And they basically convinced some alumni company to come and give some resources. They measured the carbon footprint. They figured out ways to reduce. So they were persuading people to reduce the use of electricity, etc. But they also then paid for some carbon offsetting service. This guy, Alex Song, he went on to then start his own green tech company. And this was, in fact, before it was a thing. It was before it was hot. But to be able to access the relevant expertise, because we are a standalone business school, what we lack is the technical input. And so he basically then looked for a technology partner and convinced them that if he worked alongside them, he could bring the commercial expertise that he had from his MBA, and then he has gone on to create a company, which I think he said now is valued more than 250 million, right? And has been partnering a lot with other companies, German companies, and so on, and seems to be well-placed to meet demand in China and abroad. So for me, that's a great example of two things. I think one is when you're proactive and leverage opportunity, create some opportunities, leverage opportunities, great things can happen out of this campus, but also the school then recognizes these efforts, he got a lot of visibility out of this, and I'm sure that helped a lot to attract further resources.
Could you share from your point of view? Thank you.
I think we are entering a world where we have to discount past experience and to continue to have curiosity and at the same time have an open mind. So that's the reason I think most of the people here studying at CEIBS. But I hope after school there are people would continue to form the habit of lifelong learning. I think it's important. There are many publications who will be able to provide you both a bird's eye view and a worm's eye view, and that's important, right? To have as Daniel has said, right, a bird's eye view is really like if you can look at the Earth from the moon, it will be great because you can see big pictures, you can see major trends, you can at least notice what's the next big upheaval or next big thing that could lift everything. But at the same time, you also need to understand the nitty-gritty of the latest technology changes, the latest wave of business models, applications. I'm not trying to promote The Economist. The Economist doesn't need promotion. It's being founded back in 1843. So next year we're celebrating 180 years anniversary. But what I'm trying to highlight is that it's a platform where a group of very talented journalists and editors started 100 years ago, try to cross-sourcing new ideas. So that's a form of innovation, not in pursuit of profit, but in pursuit of knowledge, ideas, analysis, insights. And that's the reason why, normally a media organization lasting more than 100 years is not easy, but they managed to do that. So we have to give them a lot of credits. And of course, I think now we are entering into a very interesting time when everyone needs to compete for people's attention. If you ask for Netflix CEO and he says, who your major competitor? Sleep. Right? If you ask the manager of Real Madrid and he said, what's your major competitor? Computer games. So of course we are a collaborator with CEIBS because we are all I think what makes what two of us have in common is that we are trying to provide you food for thought, and then we also want you to form a habit of at least I always say in the past few years, in a digital world, one thing you need to learn is to form or keep certain habits that's pre-digital, right? So like picking up a book, read something in depth. Don't focus too much on short videos, read something interesting. So that's something I want to share with you. So find a good partner. I think we need to have great network, and The Economist is actually a good network for knowledge, for insights, for new ideas, and also for different viewpoints that we encourage you to argue with. We don't expect everyone to agree what The Economist has been arguing, but I think this kind of brainstorming, this kind of collaboration, this kind of confrontation is actually interesting, and it will be, I think, benefiting for you in the long run.
Okay, so I would like to thank Mr. Wu and Ms. Zhang from Economist again, Mr. Shameen Prashantham, Mr. Liu from Shanghai HR and Social Security Bureau, and also our people who help to support make this happen.